Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight on the first actual sunny summer evening that we've had in far too long. We have had record temperatures today across the world, but I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight to join us for a special Wednesday night webinar on the crisis in Russia. We're convening tonight because I don't know about you, but I was watching everything that happened in Russia over the last couple weeks, and I kept asking myself, I wonder what Dakota has to say about this, because it was really, really confusing. And so I have invited him in here tonight to help shed light on things for the World Affairs Council of Maine. And we are really fortunate to have him as part of our leadership of the World Affairs Council of Maine and also as our resident Russia expert. For those of you who have not heard a webinar with Dakota before or got to hear him in Great Decisions or in one of our coffee and discussion sessions, he is, as I said, a member of the board of directors. He's also a global risk analyst and a PhD in Russian and Soviet history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he is one of those scholars who actually did his field work in Russia in Russian, which I think is really something that sets people apart in terms of their ability to understand the dynamics on the ground there. He was also head of research at a startup investment bank focusing on Uzbekistan and Central Asia, among his many talents. So thank you, Dakota, for stepping in once again to help us unpack events in Russia. And before I turn things over to you and start with some of our questions here, I want to just take a moment, as always, to thank our sponsors, Andrea Hester, Pat Finnegan, Jane Smith, and everyone who made a donation to our program fund. Our program fund makes tickets available to students for our in-person events. It helps us invite educators and to keep membership free for Maine students. Just a quick shout out to Professor Julie Mueller, if she's here. Yep, I think she's here tonight. She has helped us recruit over 60 student members from Southern Maine Community College. And I think a few students might even be here tonight, which is really great. And thanks to you, our membership. And of course, I want to thank you, our World Affairs Council of Maine membership. I hope we will be done to get you out in time for the fireworks. Thank you to all who sent in advanced questions. They're very, very interesting, and the rest of you can certainly submit questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom bar down there. So with no further ado, Dakota, can you walk us through what has transpired since June 24th in Russia?
Thank you, Allison. I'll do my best. To be completely honest, I'm not really sure I understand all of it, and I don't think people who do this for a living understand all of it either. So we'll do our best to make sense of what happened. But I wanted to thank you, Allison, the World Affairs Council, and all of the sponsors, and everyone for joining tonight. I think this is a really interesting topic. And I guess to start, I'll just kind of go through a bit of a blow by blow of what happened from June 23rd to June 24th. It's kind of a bit confusing in some of the things. Also, I'm sure probably no one on this call is like this, but I spend a lot of my time on Russian language Telegram, which is a kind of basically WhatsApp meets Twitter. And there was an incredible amount of disinformation being spread on that on the 23rd and the 24th as I was following it. So in some ways, people who weren't following it all probably had a better idea of what was going on than people like me. So to start, I mean, biggest picture on June 23rd, the mercenary group Wagner, private military company Wagner, staged a mutiny or rebellion, and we can talk about the semantics of this a bit later. Primarily directed against the Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of Staff, General Staff of the Russian Army, Valery Gerasimov. This was really a long-standing conflict between Wagner and its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and Shoigu and Gerasimov. This conflict was really about shortcomings of the Russian military's performance in Ukraine, supply of ammunition, control of the battlefield, how Wagner forces were being used in the quote-unquote meat grinder of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. And so this was a really public conflict that was paying out for months between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense. Putin pretty much stayed out of all of this, as he has often done in recent years in his regime, kind of let his court members fight it out without kind of giving any hints about where he stood. But the real catalyst for what happened on June 23rd and the mutiny was likely, we can't know for sure, but it was likely an order by the Ministry of Defense that was backed by Putin finally, that would compel Wagner mercenary soldiers to sign contracts with the Russian army before July 1st, which would effectively integrate them into the Russian army and kind of end them as an independent fighting force. This would potentially undermine Prigozhin's control of Wagner and all in Ukraine, but also across the world. And Wagner has a lot of lucrative contracts in Africa and the Middle East. We can discuss aspects of that later. But so many analysts kind of saw Prigozhin in a corner. He lashed out, called for the execution of Shoigu at one point in time. And ultimately on June 23rd, this all started when Prigozhin circulated a video claiming that the Ministry of Defense had struck a Wagner camp in Ukraine with missiles that had killed thousands of fighters. Most people believe that this video was at the very least manipulated and most likely fake, really no veracity to it. But Prigozhin used the video to call for an uprising of Wagner soldiers. And so throughout the night on June 23rd, there were a lot of rumors and evidence about Wagner leaving Ukraine and marching into Russia. But again, nothing happened really until the early morning of June 24th, when Wagner soldiers left Ukraine, crossed into Russia, and headed for the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is Russia's 11th largest city of about 1 million people. So a significant city, and also the location of the Southern Military District's headquarters, which is basically the nerve center of Russia's army, and the kind of center of operations for the war in Ukraine. These columns ultimately crossed into Russia unopposed. At the time, there were some rumors that the Wagner soldiers had killed 2 FSB border guards, but I've since to see this confirmed. But Wagner marched into Rostov-on-Don unopposed, captured the Southern Military District headquarters, the headquarters of the local FSB, the Internal Security Agency, and a nearby air base. And this is when Prigozhin, kind of after all these rumors were circulating, appeared on video at the Southern Military District's headquarters, and then proceeded to humiliate very openly the Deputy Defense Minister Yunusbek Yevkurov and the Deputy Chief of Russia's Military Intelligence, the GRU, Vladimir Alexeyev. This was a really surreal video. It looked very uncomfortable, but also very informal. And they actually together joked about capturing Sergei Shoigu. And there were some shooting videos in Rostov, but a lot of the footage from folks on the ground was Wagner soldiers kind of talking amicably with local residents. And so right after this, as Wagner was kind of cementing itself in Rostov, a convoy of Wagner forces, probably around 4,000 to 5,000, including soldiers and tanks, headed north toward Moscow through the Russian regions of Voronezh and Lipetsk on what they called a quote-unquote March of Justice. And here's where things got a little tricky. Around Voronezh, the Russian Air Force actually attacked the Wagner convoy, and the Wagnerites, or Wagner soldiers, actually shot down 1 to 2 Russian military helicopters and a fixed-wing airplane, and this led to the death of at least 13 Russian military personnel. And at the same time, Wagner also attacked an oil refinery in Voronezh. So for much of the 23rd, the day before this was going out, Putin was kind of silent, but then on the morning of the 24th, he gave a televised address calling Wagner's actions treason and comparing the event to the Russian Revolution. Putin also promised harsh steps to suppress the mutiny. But at the same time, that didn't really happen. So the convoy kind of progressed to Moscow, faced almost no armed resistance. And following the news, there was absolute panic spreading throughout Russia. Putin was silent. The Ministry of Defense was silent. And on the road between Moscow and Voronezh, local officials began ripping up the highways using excavators. They blocked roadways with trucks, which Wagner moved through quite easily, barricaded and moved bridges. And as this was going on, supposedly at the same time, quote unquote elite forces associated with the Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov, these are called Kadyrovsi, were mobilized and were being sent to Rostov-on-Don. And throughout the day, there were all these reports that they were just about to arrive and that they would fight and crush Wagner. But they ended up only showing up after the mutiny had ended and didn't do any fighting. This has kind of been a frequent criticism of Kadyrov soldiers, particularly in the war in Ukraine, that they kind of only show up at the end. But they did record some TikTok videos set to music about their adventures in the south of Russia. So they praise themselves as heroes. And so as all this is going on, the convoy is getting closer. The FSB raided Wagner's offices in St. Petersburg. There are reports that they were threatening the families of Wagner fighters, especially the convicts. And there was this idea that Moscow, the capital, was going to be defended by units of Rosgvardia, which is a kind of National Guard slash crowd control force, the FSB, policemen, and some nearby military units. So it looked like there was going to be a real conflict. But while this was going on, there were, of course, negotiations. Yevgeny Prigozhin reportedly wanted to speak to only high-ranking officials, particularly Putin, who refused to speak to him. And ultimately, in a really bizarre move that we can discuss again later, Belarusian dictator Aleksandr Lukashenka stepped in and brokered a deal with Wagner when the soldiers were about 200 to 400 kilometers outside of Moscow. So fairly close. And so ultimately, on the night of June 24th, Prigozhin announced that the mutiny was over. The columns turned around from Moscow. Wagner left Rostov-on-Don, and there were some really stunning videos of them basically receiving a hero's goodbye, people taking selfies with Prigozhin, cheering in the streets. Really not a great look for the Kremlin after Putin caught all of this treason. And ultimately, the deal that they signed between Wagner that Lukashenko brokered was that Wagner would relocate its bases to Belarus with all the fighters who participated in the insurrection, including Prigozhin. They would ultimately be amnestied as long as they left. The Wagner soldiers who didn't participate would be allowed to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, which is what kind of started this whole thing, which again would effectively end Wagner's independent participation in the Ukrainian war effort. And Prigozhin would not be charged and would also again relocate to Belarus. Now, has any of that actually come to pass? Yes, although the location of Prigozhin is still a bit unknown today. He's supposedly flying back between St. Petersburg and Moscow and Belarus. There's been photographs of camps being built in Belarus, but again, there's no kind of significant movement of Wagner forces that has been reported. So that's kind of where things stand now. I think there's a lot to unpack there after that.
There, just a little bit to unpack. I mean, the picture that you're painting for us, I think, is much more chaotic and also alarming than I think we've really heard an account in the media before. And so I've got a lot to sort of think over, particularly talking about, this actual exchange of fire between the Wagner forces and the Russian Air Force. But I want to start with asking, who is this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin? I mean, last I heard, he started as a cook.
Mhm.
He doesn't apparently have any military experience or real sort of economic or consulting experience. Who is he? Why do we care about him? And more importantly, who is he in relation to Putin? And why does Putin care what he thinks and what he does?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question and a good place to start. I started talking about Wagner and didn't even mention Prigozhin's name because in the world of Russia watchers, he's a ubiquitous figure, but I recognize that probably most people have gone most of their lives without hearing his name, and that's a good thing. Yevgeny Prigozhin, I think the best way I could describe him is he's a very odious figure. This is someone who emerged from the St. Petersburg criminal underground. He served a 9-year prison sentence in the Soviet Union and around the collapse of the Soviet Union. Basically, he strangled a woman while his associates stole her jewelry. So this is the kind of person we're talking to, kind of assault and theft kind of crime, not white collar crime. And so after he was released from prison in the early 90s, he reinvented himself, as many people did in that time period, as a businessman. He focused on the restaurant industry in particular. And he actually got to start selling hot dogs, so not quite high dining. But he eventually became successful, as many people did, kind of worked his way up. And at some point in the time in the 1990s, he met a young official in the mayor of St. Petersburg's office named Vladimir Putin, and they became close together. Putin, again, has a history of surrounding himself with people from the St. Petersburg criminal underworld. That's kind of himself not a criminal, but there are a lot of links in the later period of the Soviet Union between the KGB and organized crime. Nothing we can really go into here. But again, they kind of found each other there, and Prigozhin kind of developed as a major restaurateur, opened several high dining restaurants in St. Petersburg. Putin actually hosted several world leaders at Prigozhin's restaurants, including George W. Bush, I believe in 2003, at his restaurant, which was on a boat on the Neva River. So throughout the 2000s, Yevgeny Prigozhin was kind of using his connections to Putin to kind of strengthen his ties with the Kremlin. And his catering company, Concord Catering, won a bunch of lucrative contracts from the government to supply food to schools, government workers, and eventually the Russian military. And these are kind of like billions of dollars worth of contracts. And that's why he gets this reputation as Putin's chef, although it's unclear to me that he ever did actually cooking himself. And the food that was provided by Concord was reportedly very low quality. I mean, most of this money was stolen, as often happened. There was actually a major dysentery outbreak in Moscow schools in 2019 linked to food provided by Concord, Prigozhin's Concord. So, as I said, this is a kind of classic criminal figure. Many of these people in Russia, but he's someone who earned a reputation for getting things done. He also emerged as someone who was known to kind of do proactively what he thought the Kremlin wanted without ever being instructed to. And this is where we get the kind of infamous setting up of the troll factories in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency, which attempted to, or interfered with the US elections in 2016. The result of that interference, I'm quite skeptical of, and also a propaganda network called Patriot Media that was basically kind of hardline, nationalist, anti-Western, pro-Kremlin. So he began to diversify his business interests. None more than in 2014 when he founded the Wagner private military company. And this is almost certainly at the behest of the Kremlin. First off, as a way to deploy Russian soldiers to the war that was emerging in the Donbass after Russia stoked an uprising there and sent some actual regular soldiers into eastern Ukraine. But they also wanted to create a force that could be involved in things that the Russian state and the Russian military couldn't officially do. And they were very explicitly modeled after Blackwater, the infamous US mercenary company that was engaged in several atrocities in the war in Iraq. So again, they're very much channeling the US experience there. And Wagner over time became and still is quite active in Africa and the Middle East. They fought supporting Assad during the Syrian civil war, and also have been involved in a lot of internal conflicts throughout Africa. But the interesting thing here, Wagner up until June 23rd was really celebrated as kind of being heroic, but Prigozhin actually never officially admitted to having anything to do with the organization. And actually, up until the point where he admitted it after Russia invaded Ukraine full scale in 2022, had kind of launched a bunch of lawsuits against Russian journalists for saying that he had anything to do with Wagner. And throughout this time, Wagner was publicly led by a man by the name of Dmitry Utkin, who worked for Prigozhin. Utkin, very simply, is a neo-Nazi with SS tattoos on his body. He was a veteran of Russia's war in Chechnya. And supposedly he was the one that led the column that was heading for Moscow while Prigozhin was in Rostov-on-Don. But again, this can't be confirmed. So that's who Prigozhin is. And a bit more background is that Wagner, although they've been a major fighting force in Ukraine, particularly around the Battle of Bakhmut, this is an extremely lucrative business with contracts and interest in Africa, particularly in the Central African Republic, where they're kind of in charge of gold and mining operations. So that's, in sparking this conflict, Prigozhin's business interests across the globe are almost as important as the conflict in Ukraine. And so, Wagner is very opportunistic and are hired by both dictators and rebels throughout Africa. And this is really what Prigozhin was trying to hold on to. Wagner also fought very briefly on Armenia's side during a brief unsuccessful war with Azerbaijan. They famously came into contact with US troops in Syria and did not fare well. But throughout all of this, Wagner has always acted as an extension of the Russian state. It was funded by Russia. It's advanced Russia's interest. The Kremlin has liked Wagner in particular because it always provided plausible deniability that they weren't actually involved in these actions. Although, ironically, throughout all of this, Russia, of course, there is no rule of law there, but they do have a weird obsession with legalism. But ironically, and legal formality, but ironically, mercenary companies are illegal in Russia. So Wagner was never even a legal entity, even though it existed and had a massive headquarters in downtown St. Petersburg. I would say that while Wagner has been a useful tool for the Russian state, it's important not to overstate its global power as some kind of super powerful global network. It's a mercenary company with interest in areas where there are conflicts, and it has played an important role, but not always a decisive role.
I think that's really interesting. I saw that last night that mercenary companies are illegal in Russia, and of course, that was on the back of a really detailed report on what's going on right now in the Central African Republic. And what I think was so interesting about that was how supposedly this is a mercenary group, but Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is sort of, saying, oh no, everything is going to be fine. And so there's a lot there that we could talk about for hours, for sure, in terms of Wagner and what it's doing globally and its relationship with the Russian military. But I think what a lot of people are speculating and interested in is, was this a coup? And I'm really hearing that it wasn't, that it was not an actual attack on Putin. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's interesting how much the semantic discussion has become important about what we call this event, because it certainly does signify more. Yeah, I think almost everyone agrees that this isn't a kind of standard coup, in that Prigozhin was definitely not looking to overthrow Putin. They've always presented themselves as Putin's kind of the most loyal servants of the Russian state, real patriots who are trying to kind of correct wrongs. And so the term everyone has kind of mostly agreed on, analysts, has been mutiny, which makes sense as a kind of internal military struggle. You could also use the word rebellion. Personally, though, I think the distinction is not as important as people make it out to be, because at the end of the day, imagine that this had been successful, that they had made it to Moscow and they had deposed the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, but kept Putin in power. Would he really still be in power? I mean, if anything more than a figurehead, the government is appointed by the president, right? Sergei Shoigu is clearly Putin's man. Gerasimov is clearly Putin's man. And if he removed these or forced Putin to remove them, it raises serious questions about his power in an authoritarian system that is entirely based on his personal authority. So while it's not explicitly a coup, he was certainly seeking to reshape Russian government policy and also to assert kind of control over the war effort, which, again, these are very much in the prerogatives of the authoritarian president of Russia. So yeah, he did not want to get rid of Putin for sure, but at the same time, what he was seeking to achieve, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, is not just some kind of minor military matter. And what I think is also interesting, and we can pull on this thread a little bit more, but what Prigozhin was saying, particularly right before and during the uprising, was really very populist, anti-government rhetoric that basically blamed the elites and the oligarchs for ruining the war effort and making the ordinary Russian people suffer. Now, this is something we've heard throughout Russian history. There are lots of historical parallels to this. A lot of commentators at the time brought up the rebellion of Yemelin and Pugachev under Catherine the Great, which was beautifully captured in Alexander Pushkin's The Captain's Daughter. Recommend that read. Very nice, fun summer novel. But also during the First World War, General Lavr Kornilov was a kind of reactionary conservative general who marched a column against the provisional government to try to overthrow for mishandling the war effort. So at the same time, he's drawing on very populist, anti-authoritarian or anti-government rhetoric marching from the periphery to the center. And this has a long history in Russia, has always kind of been seen as an attempt to assert power over the center and to kind of correct these wrongs, even though Prigozhin himself is, of course, an oligarch. And that's actually interesting what the Kremlin media has kind of focused on since all this has happened. So in a roundabout way, no, it wasn't a coup, but it was something more than a mutiny, in my opinion.
Well, I think, this is the difference between political scientists and historians, right? I mean, we obsess over definitions because we want to make clear historical comparisons, for us to sort of, make predictions, but also kind of analyze what really happened. And I think it's what you're saying is important to me and sounds to me that actually, no, this was clearly more than a mutiny. And while he was not trying to remove Putin himself, it really seems like it was much more of a attack on the regime that's around Putin. And so I just wonder, the next question that I have here is whether or not this has weakened Putin, this challenge in this extent,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or has he been
and
able, to bounce back?
well, if you trust the Kremlin PR, he certainly has. But
Well, okay.
yeah, we don't here. Yeah, and to be clear, I'm really not saying it's a coup, but it was a power rush, and clearly Prigozhin, I think, expected the military and the security forces to be on his side throughout all of this. I mean, that's why we saw these kind of like bizarre hostage videos from some of his supporters in the military. General Sergei Serovikin, who was known as kind of a close confidant of Wagner, who was reportedly detained, hasn't been seen in public for a while. It's unclear if we're going to get a show trial or anything like that. Also, General Alexeyev of the GRU, who also kind of filmed a kind of hostage video like that. So I think Prigozhin expected people to rise up in support, and maybe it's possible that he had the limited goals of just removing the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, and then everything would go back to normal. I somehow have a hard time believing that. But in any case, I think there's no doubt that Putin, as president, is weaker after this. That being said, how weak is difficult to say, and it's clear the regime is not going to collapse anytime soon. I mean, I don't think this fundamentally weakened the regime to the point where it's on the verge of collapse in the near future. There are, of course, some kind of people who advance the ideas that this was all created by Putin as like a distraction or a way to subversively move Wagner soldiers into Belarus to attack from the north. But again, this is like 2 weeks later and they're not really in Belarus, so it'd be like the worst surprise attack ever. So I mean, I think it's clear that this wasn't something that was created by the Kremlin. The Kremlin did obviously lose control of it. And I thought it was interesting seeing U.S. security forces leaking all this stuff to the papers recently, basically saying, "Oh, we knew about this the whole time. We knew all these generals who knew about this." Is a clear attempt at, I guess you would call, psychological warfare by the U.S. side, capitalizing on this instance. So yeah, it's definitely weak. It's definitely a PR disaster for the Kremlin, and they've kind of been trying to kind of fix this problem because they know it runs pretty deep. At the same time, also wanting to move on and not talk about it that much. A lot of it's been kind of banished, but then you see kind of discussions from even Putin himself about the idea that Prigozhin had received billions of dollars from the Russian state and probably stole some of it. They're basically trying to present him as an oligarch in the way that he was attacking the elites, to kind of show that he's not one of you, the common people, which of course is true, but a very deliberate point. Putin went to Dagestan soon after the mutiny, and there was all this highly choreographed event of him kind of meeting people on the street and really celebrating and how much they loved him. So it's clear that they know something needs to happen, and that the regime, what's probably a bigger blow to the regime is not the fact that the Wagner column got within 200 kilometers of Moscow, but the fact that they basically made a deal with a traitor. And that's why Lukashenko was involved in this, because the president himself couldn't be seen to be making a deal with someone who is going against the Russian state. So that's a huge blow as well. I think there are some interesting ideas. I mean, this is the kind of the most mysterious thing because no one really understands exactly what's going on inside the Kremlin, or if there's going to be a wave of purges, as there has been in previous times in Russian history. I'm a follower of a Russian political analyst named Tatiana Stanovaya. She works for the Carnegie Endowment, but also is kind of she opines on all things kind of internal Russian politics. But she advanced an interesting theory that we're kind of in a new phase, and have been recently, where the elites are just manipulating Putin, that he's kind of lost his grip on the situation because he's made his circle so small and listens to so few people, that he kind of has a very distorted picture of the world. And that, when he went to Dagestan and was hugging and taking selfies with all these people, that he probably believed it might have been real,
Hmm.
but when it was clearly staged. So, and he has had this reputation recently of being very aloof. Before Russia invaded, the full scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, he had a kind of reputation for letting internal domestic power struggles play out on their own, and he would only get involved in the big foreign policy stuff. So, the idea that he controls internal Russian politics with an iron fist, I think it hasn't been true for a while, if it ever was true. And again, to use an overwrought historical analogy, this is very similar to the kind of dynamic of the boyars and the czar, kind of these elite clans who really do the day-to-day operation of Russia, kind of struggling with each other in a battle for rents. Basically, it's all rent seeking for money and power, whereas the czar kind of acts as the court of final appeal between competing factions. So I think that's still going on here. The big question is, will we see the wave of does the Kremlin and Putin feel weak enough that they need a wave of repressions, which in itself is also a sign of weakness. We haven't seen it yet. A lot of people think it's not coming. It's unclear. We haven't seen any kind of change in the mobilization rhetoric or the kind of mobilization of the economy behind the war effort. So I think a lot of people would like to move away from this while slowly chipping away at Prigozhin and Wagner's position within Russian political culture.
So I guess what you're saying is that there's a line of thinking that this may in fact be over, that we're not going to sort of see purges, we're not going to see further, um, I don't want to say attacks on Putin, but sort of further kind of around the back assaults on him, that it's stabilized enough? Or is it rather that the elites around Putin still have enough interest in keeping him there that this is going to kind of be tamped down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, really, really difficult to say, right? What's actually going on. I think that it's clear that the kind of hot phase of this mutiny is definitely over. I think that we will not see kind of renewed hostilities between Wagner and the Russian army. Although, again, anything is possible. I guess I should guard myself there. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the one big kind of the real challenge that this raises, and it's a slow burning one for the regime, is I think the elites will start thinking more about who replaces Putin, about who comes next. The fact that the authority has been challenged, and it's something, you really can't put the genie back in the bottle. And the fact of the matter is, it's not like the
Right.
people of Russia went out to the streets to defend Moscow or Rostov-on-Don from the mercenaries, right? In Rostov, they were celebrating and taking selfies with them. So it's clear that many people weren't willing to die to protect the Kremlin, which is a major problem for this kind of authority, personalized authority, especially when you're in the middle of a war. So the slow burning consequence of this, I think, will go on. I think we'll probably see more elite struggles. And a lot of times when you see repression, waves of repression that are launched, they're not always top down. Sometimes they're bottom up, and sometimes they're intra elite, right? We could see more arrests or more struggles that are not necessarily coming from the Kremlin itself, but from these different factions that see an opportunity. Because one of the things that Putin does, and again, I hate these overwrought historical metaphors, so I'm kind of breaking my own rule as a historian, but there's a lot of similarities in the past, and that basically you keep these courtiers, these court members, fighting each other so that they don't want any single one of them to replace the czar, right, the president, right? It's much better for the regime to have them fighting each other than to have them kind of unifying behind one candidate. So the elite is were particularly worried about Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he specifically called out a very wealthy suburb of Moscow called Rubliovka, that they would kind of attack Rubliovka, which is where all the theoretically most of the oligarchs live. So that would be a disaster. But any one of them doesn't want another one to take control, right? Because then they'll see themselves as getting punished. So it's a slow burning thing that will kind of play out. But I think also in the eyes of the Russian people, it's also clear that the regime is weaker than it was 2 weeks ago. There's no doubt about that.
This is just so fascinating. And so, um, I'm just looking at the audience questions now at this point, looking at some of the ones that were sent in ahead of time. One of them seems to tie in nicely with this discussion of sort of the oligarchs behind the regime, the elites kind of, working together or not working together, fighting each other. If Putin does in fact lose his control on power, who are the likeliest replacements? Are there any heir apparents out there? Or has he sort of managed to do like so many other good authoritarians that you sort of decapitate anyone who could potentially challenge you or have them accidentally fall out a window?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of that going on in Russia these days. Yeah, I think there is no clear heir apparent, and that's obviously by design. At the same time, I would say that it wasn't until relatively late in Boris Yeltsin's administration that someone named Vladimir Putin came on the stage. And if you ask people in 1996 who was the heir apparent to Yeltsin, not a soul would have said Vladimir Putin. And again, we are talking years out, in my opinion, at the least, for when if Putin is ever going to be toppled in power. Interestingly, a lot of people before the war, one of the most popular candidates that was put up as a potential replacement was Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, who, after all of this situation, is clearly no longer in that position. Some of the kind of powerful, shady figures behind Putin, from his Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, Sergei Naryshkin. These are kind of classic, Russian word for it is siloviki. I guess in English you translate it as like security forces. These are the kind of people who are seen to be exercising the most power and influence right now. But at the same time, they're not public figures. They're not charismatic. They're not people that would ever kind of lead a country. They work more in the shadows. So I think it's pretty unclear who would replace him. And it's also unclear, more importantly, would this system that he's created, this very particular personalized authoritarian system, would that live on after him, after he exits, And at the same time, as much as we want to hope that if Putin is deposed, we'll get some kind of more liberal figure who will end the war in Ukraine, the likelihood is, just the same that it'll be someone who will go the opposite way. So, I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin explicitly said he wanted to turn Russia into North Korea, in terms of kind of full isolation and full militarization for the war effort. So you're certainly not in the halls of power right now. Is there anyone who would actively call for the end of the war in Ukraine? So it remains to be seen, I think. But this kind of the return to the worst excesses of Cold War Kremlinology and looking at photographs of people of the leader and their proximity to the leader as a kind of guess about who is in power and who will be next. I don't think that is particularly useful for anyone.
Well, I think what is useful, and you're saying this, and just about everything I've read saying this, is it's almost irrelevant which one of this cast of characters sort of stepped in for Putin, if it is, and everybody's assuming it's going to be the same kind of a regime, that whoever steps in, they're not really going to change the fundamentals of how business is done. They are sort of perhaps going to replace Putin, but certainly not be any different. And there's really, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but everything that I am reading says there's really no indication of any kind of a pro-democracy or any kind of sort of a sea change that would indicate no.
Definitely not. I mean,
Which,
on the one hand, I would say it depends on the nature. If Putin is removed from power, if it's a palace coup or a revolution, a palace coup is, of course, more likely, I think, than a popular revolution.
yeah.
But yeah, you would expect, if he was removed by the elites, to kind of keep things going on the similar track, at the very least, for their maintaining of their own business interests, prosecuting the war, continuing the war. It's unclear kind of what would happen there. I would say that in particular, in terms of democracy, I mean, this there is a very strong negative association of that word in Russia that people associate with the 1990s. And I don't know if I've said this on one of these before, but in Russia, there's the word demokratia, which means democracy, but you'll probably hear people call it dermokratia, which translates to something like shitocracy. People don't want any part of this. This is not a legitimate political project. Even some of the opposition leaders, I mean, ostensibly liberals, you would hope, but the idea of Alexei Navalny becoming president outside of a revolution is, of course, extremely remote. So anyone that's not in jail or outside of the country, there's very, very few advocates, if any, for a kind of democratic transition. Certainly not in Russia. And the last thing I will say is that I haven't read this yet, but an interesting article that was published in a scholarly journal and basically argued that Russia never democratized after 1990 and the fall of the Soviet Union because there was no changeover in the elites and the people running the country at the middle levels. So, is there even a democratic tradition in Russia? As in, there's not in many countries in the world, to be honest. So I think that hopes for that kind of transition are unlikely unless there's a complete collapse of the state, which again, that happens, people will have an even worse association with the word democracy than they already do.
Well, not encouraging. So I want to shift to the audience questions, and they're kind of helpfully grouping themselves into two groups. The first group are related to what does this mean for the internal dynamics inside of Russia?
Mhm.
And then the second group, which I want to kind of finish with, what does this mean for Ukraine? What does this mean for NATO? What does this sort of mean for broader, geopolitical questions emanating out of the war? So I want to start with a couple kind of specific ones. Um, you know, you painted a really serious picture of what was happening in those early days. And one of the questions that was here from Bill Franks is why didn't the Russian forces blow the bridges on the River Orca to prevent Wagner from reaching Moscow?
That's a great question. I mean, these are things that I'm not sure we'll ever know. I certainly don't know. My assumption is that by the time the Wagner column had gotten that far into Moscow Oblast, Moscow region, getting kind of close to the capital, that the negotiations were already in an advanced stage, and it was clear that this was ultimately going to be called off in a deal brokered by Lukashenko. Um, all of the quote unquote resistance was a bit half-hearted. Even the fact that they use excavators to dig up the highways and put, parking a bunch of buses on there. There are videos of the Wagner kind of tanks and trucks just pushing the buses to the side and moving through. So I think it's a difficult question to answer why there wasn't more resistance. The only thing that makes any sense to me is that it was somehow aware or communicated that discussions were going on in the background, and there was a desire to prevent an escalation of violence that would, because on the day, a lot of people were saying, "Don't spill Russian blood," and so maybe those were steps to there. But it's an excellent question. I wish I had a better answer.
And related to that, one of the things that I found the most interesting was the rapidity with which this deal with Lukashenko, who's always kind of presented as this, I mean, sort of Putin's kind of elf on a shelf, not really, not really having any kind of his own sort of power, so to speak. And so why did this deal happen so quickly? Is it a good deal for Putin? I mean, is this sort of the best possible outcome to sort of have the Wagner Group and Prigozhin sort of set up next door? And, Prigozhin's also walking around between St. Petersburg. I mean, is what's going on here? But let's start with this Lukashenko, because I think that question is really interesting. Why did he
Okay.
emerge as the mediator?
Excellent question. I mean, to be fair to Lukashenko, he is a very wily character. He has consistently throughout his time played a very weak hand as well as he could in terms of his Belarus's relationship with Russia and this kind of long-standing idea that Russia is going to reabsorb Belarus as a union state. Um, Lukashenko and Putin, I think, as far as I understand from internal dialogues, they despise each other. But Lukashenko has always been someone who will kind of step in certain times to support the Russian line. And of course, Putin famously rescued Lukashenko in the summer of 2020 as protests engulfed the country around the election. He stole some Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So why was it Lukashenko? Well, we know that Prigozhin wanted to speak to high-ranking officials, and Putin refused to speak to him, which makes sense. He went on TV and called him a traitor, so he would never kind of engage in negotiations with that. And I think that the Kremlin, I read some kind of analysis that suggested that these negotiations with Prigozhin were kind of ongoing in the previous couple of days, and they consistently thought he was bluffing until the convoy started getting a little bit too close to Moscow and realized that this was not necessarily a bluff anymore, but they needed to actually do something. Lukashenko is an opportunist. I mean, he's certainly been milking all the PR he can out of this, presenting himself as someone who saved Russia. And basically, he's claiming that he convinced Putin not to launch missiles on Wagner and basically saved Russian lives by his intervention and calming him down. We'll never know what kind of discussions actually went on. But Lukashenko definitely has inserted himself into this. In some ways, Lukashenko provided an off-ramp for everyone, because in my opinion, frankly, the deal is bad for everyone. That's why I still find it inexplicable that all of this happened. But the deal is bad for the Kremlin in that these people who openly flouted state authority and tried to march on Moscow are let go. In Russia, they killed 13 Russian airmen. In Russia, if you post on Facebook or Vkontakte with something against the war, you could get 10 years in jail. These guys murdered 13 Russian airmen, and they're walking free and having a wonderful summer in Minsk. It's unbelievable. It doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, it's also a bad deal for Prigozhin because he accomplished none of his goals. Wagner looks like it will be, the parts that remain in Ukraine will be absorbed into the MOD. Maybe. I mean, this was the deal. Again, this is not like an official deal that they signed with a bunch of photographs. Like, no one's ever seen the text of this deal. This has all been kind of communicated by Lukashenko and Dmitry Peskov, who's a famous liar. And who knows if Wagner is going to continue its operations as is throughout the rest of the world. Prigozhin must know he's a marked man. So I know, and I also find it completely inexplicable that he's flying back and forth between St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Belarus. I have no explanation for it. I think that this must be deals being made at the highest levels of the government, that Putin himself is not involving himself in this anymore. I really don't know. Perhaps the Kremlin is worried about another uprising of Wagner if they move against Prigozhin, that you have all these armed guys with tanks that have already done it once and kind of gotten away with it. Maybe they'll do it again. But ultimately, I don't know. I find it totally inexplicable.
It's interesting, as you were talking, I was sort of having flashes back to the 1970s with Jordan. You've got Gamal Abdel Nasser, King Hussein in Jordan, and then Yasser Arafat, and it almost seems to a certain extent to be the same dynamic, where you have one party playing a very weak hand as well as he can to sort of hold on to what's there, while these other people are wreaking havoc and making mischief for their own agendas.
That's a good way to put it.
Let's shift now to the implications of this, for the first of all, for the war in Ukraine. So what there have been a couple questions here specifically. What are the risks? Are there any risks for NATO? Well, actually, where was one? There were states during the mutiny which were critical of the. Has this had any kind of a demoralizing impact on the fighters, the Russian fighters who are sort of fighting the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I don't know exactly. I mean, there's not exactly a lot of polling available on the attitude of Russian soldiers. I think a lot of people, when it happened, expected that it would have a more significant impact on the war effort, but it appears in the 2 weeks since that it has had very little impact ultimately, which is disappointing, I think, for the West and for NATO. I think it's important that the military did not exactly rally behind the Kremlin, but it also didn't rally behind Prigozhin either. You know, it's a kind of apathetic wait and see what's going on here. It's definitely unclear that this had or will have any effect on the war effort. I think there was another question about, you know, where things stand right now on the ground in the battlefield, and Ukraine's offensive is progressing, but quite slowly. I think everyone would admit that it has not been the lightning strike that many people had expected. In particular, everyone was ready to compare this with the swift retaking of territory in the Kharkiv region that happened last year. I think it was clear that was never going to happen because Russia has had time to dig in, to lay a bunch of minefields, to kind of reinforce and prepare for this. You know, this offensive was being talked about in the media for 4 months before it's coming. Everyone knew it was coming. It was going to happen. Ukraine is making very slow gains in Bakhmut and in the south. But a lot of this, unfortunately for Ukraine, is a game of expectations management. The expectations for the offensive were very high, and the results have not met that yet. We certainly hope that it will be. Ukraine clearly hasn't committed its reserves, and is not delivering the punch that everyone expected because they haven't really had a breakthrough yet. But yeah, it's kind of unclear that the Prigozhin mutiny had any real material effect on the battleground yet. It's unclear what happens to all these Wagner soldiers, if in fact they are going to Belarus. There's still not a ton of evidence that they're actually there yet. They were an effective fighting force, if only for the fact that they were kind of throwing convicts as cannon fodder, which had been helpful. And they kind of absorbed a lot of the losses in Bakhmut. So maybe Russia would have to rely on mobilized soldiers for that. But I don't know. I think that when it was happening in the day of, seemed like it was going to be a significant event. And 2 weeks later, it doesn't appear to be, from my perspective.
So, given that, there's a couple questions here that look at the end game. Since this has not sort of derailed the Russian ability to hold territory, the Ukrainian offensive is not really being able to capitalize on this in any way. It's moving very, very slowly. Is there any possible momentum towards a negotiated settlement that you think might come out of this?
I'm deeply skeptical of what that's going to look like. There was a report recently, I think either early this week or last week, where someone in Ukraine, either in the military and the government, was basically saying their plan was, with this offensive and future offensives, was to retake a much of the territory, to drive south to the land border of Crimea, and then open negotiations with the Kremlin. I personally, I don't understand exactly how a negotiated settlement can come out of this. It just seems that both sides have very little to gain from a negotiated settlement as the battlefield stands right now. I mean, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to kind of give up the territory that Russia has already occupied and captured. And at this point in the Kremlin, I think it's too much of an existential struggle for them to take anything other than the maximalist gains of these new territories that they currently occupy, although not entirely all of these regions. There was an interesting report that I read recently. I don't remember the source exactly, but they were suggesting that a lot of people in the Kremlin are starting to think that what the United States and NATO and the West want to do is basically exactly what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine, which is dismantle it as a functioning state, turn it into kind of maybe take some parts off of it and put in a puppet regime. And Russia takes this seriously because it's exactly what they're trying to do to Ukraine. They think that's what the West wants to do to Russia. So at that point, they have no incentive to de-escalate. They have very little incentive to negotiate because this is is becoming to be understood an existential crisis. Not only for the regime. At the beginning, it was clear this is always an existential crisis of the regime because Putin waged so much on it. But I think, a lot of stuff has been coming out of DC think tanks and in the media suggesting that Russia should be quote unquote decolonized and kind of split up. These constituent republics should be kind of removed from the Russian state. And I'm not sure how serious that discourse is in the United States. I think it's being put out there by people who don't have a deep understanding of Russia, but people in the Kremlin are taking that seriously. And so, in that sense, they really have the only, in my mind, the only incentives for them are further escalation. And again, Russia has a lot more room to escalate. They're not even anywhere close to kind of committing the entire number of soldiers they could draft or putting the economy along a more war footing. So I you know I personally I want I as many people hope that Ukraine decisively wins this war on the battlefield, but even if they were able to kind of take back the territories and go back to the borders of February 24th, I don't know why Russia would then negotiate, because they would be in such a precarious position that taking those losses and then negotiating a peace settlement, I don't think the regime could survive that.
So this notion of Russia breaking up into individual states is more sort of inside Washington Beltway than and something that people with Russia are seeing as external meddling as opposed to an actual possibility. Just trying to answer one of the questions here.
I have to choose my words very carefully here because I feel quite
Okay.
strongly about this topic.
Yeah.
I think this idea is being put forward by people who do not have a lot of expertise or experience in Russia. I think that personally, I don't think it's a very serious idea. I don't think people in the Biden administration or in the governments of Europe take this idea seriously. I don't even think it would be an outcome that they would want. And I think the idea of redrawing another country's borders from Washington and London has kind of already proved a bit disastrous in the past. I'm not sure why the situation would be any better. But at the same time, the Kremlin consumes this information. The Kremlin blasts this out on their own kind of propaganda and media. And at the end of the day, even if Russians disagree with the war effort silently, and there's not a lot of room for expression of protest, if you're talking about the dismantling of the Russian state, even people who are anti-war would be against that. So I'm not sure who it serves, and I don't think it's a very serious proposal.
And, connecting to that, I want to answer Bob Edel's question here. Based on what you're saying, it really doesn't seem like there's any pressure within the elite to bring about any kind of an end to the war. If anything, Russia might actually be interested in seeing more of an escalation to sort of, rally around the flag, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think it depends. The elite is not a monolithic group, right? There's always been historically under the Putin regime who divided the elite into two camps: the kind of hardliners and the more liberal technocrats. The liberal technocrats who probably didn't support the idea of the war and didn't know about it originally are doing what they can to kind of keep the state functioning. The hardliners are calling for increased escalation. Um, but one of the issues, I think that the United States and the West sanctions policies have been effective, have hampered Russia's ability to wage the war. But at the same time, it does have a kind of perverse effect of consolidating a lot of the elites, because now a lot of these people have no business interest outside of Russia anymore. It's kind of completely cut off for them. So now they're trying to hold on what they have, trying to keep a hold of their rents within Russia. So, I think that a lot of people, probably most of the elites, know this has been a disaster, know that Russia is ultimately losing the war. But there was a great quote. The media publication Medusa interviewed some ordinary people about who supported the war, but read Medusa, which is an opposition publication, and they basically said a war is bad, but the only thing worse is losing a war. So I think that is kind of a key part here, that this has been a disaster for Russia. It's been a disaster for the elites, but at the same time, the only thing that would be more of a disaster would be if Russia lost. So I don't think there's a ton of pressure, because at the same time, I think it's right that the West and NATO has not really provided any negotiating off ramps. I think that's the right move to avoid appeasement, but there are no signals for off ramps. So there's not really anything that Russian elites, even if they did want this, would have to kind of latch onto.
So there's a question here in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, asking, what you attribute the U.S. allowance of Russia's repeated patterns of aggressive behavior to Ukraine and other countries. I found that question interesting, because indicating that the United States has sort of allowed this, and if we look to 2014, perhaps we could certainly say that we certainly didn't have their presence in Syria. I mean, very different dynamic, of course. But I wonder if sort of the not letting Ukraine, perhaps the kind of background talk that we're hearing about putting forward some sort of a Korea deal, or sort of putting pressure on Ukraine to kind of, let's draw an arms line and be done with it kind of thing. I mean, do you think there's anything to that? And what would sort of be the United States motivation for kind of allowing Russia to get off the hook, if there's anything to that?
Yeah, that's good. So I think there's two questions there. Catch me if I don't go back to the first one. Why is the United States allowed Russia to do this? On the one hand, I think it's a fair question. The invasion and seizure of Crimea in 2014 was obviously a watershed moment. I was actually living in Moscow when that happened. It was pretty crazy, but at the same time, things kind of went back to normal quite quickly. We lived in a different world then. In retrospect, it was obviously a mistake to have let them get away with that. But to be clear, that wasn't just the US's decision. The EU was also not exactly kind of clamoring to kind of put a response. And what does a response to that look like? More significant sanctions like the ones that we've seen after the full-scale invasion? Potentially, but at that point in time, Russia was still integrated in the European and global economic system in the way that China is now. And there was a belief widespread at the time that as long as you keep these kind of aggressive authoritarian countries kind of caught in the global economic system, that will have some kind of moderating impact on them. Now it's clear that that is not true, and we're obviously kind of detangling our economic relationship with China as well. But in 2014, that was very much the idea. And also, if we say that they're going to allow them to do this other than sanctions, I don't think that there is a particular appetite in either the United States or Europe for direct military conflict. And let's remember, Russia is a nuclear armed power. This isn't Iraq. This isn't kind of other countries that the United States has used its military weight to put behind, or escalating to a direct military conflict between two nuclear powers is quite dangerous. And I think rightfully both sides did not engage in that, and we're still far away from that. So was the United States wrong to let and the EU let Putin get away with this in 2014? Without a doubt, it was clearly a mistake and clearly paved the way for what happened in both the kind of ongoing war in the Donbass and the full invasion from February. So absolutely. In terms of the idea of a brokered Korea deal, in my personal opinion, and all of this is just my personal opinion, not that of the World Affairs Council of Maine or of anyone else, just my opinion. I think quite cynically, I think that a Korea style deal is probably the best outcome in the short term that's going to come out of this. Although I don't see it happening kind of anytime soon. The problem is again that there's really not a lot of incentive for Ukraine to stop fighting, and as they shouldn't. They're defending their country, they're defending their people. Bringing Russia to the table, getting Russia and Ukraine to negotiate with each other is going to be very difficult. The United States would do this, of course, for political reasons, right? And we have an election coming up, and when that happens, it's not clear necessarily guaranteed that the next president that comes in is going to want to continue the war effort, at least in the same kind of level of commitment that the Biden administration has in delivering weapons. And could they be delivering more? Definitely. There's all this discussion about longer range missiles. Should they be provided? I think they should, but I also don't think that they're going to have a de-escalatory impact on Russia. It's not going to make Russia back down. In my opinion, it's going to make Russia kind of escalate further. So how we get to that negotiated Korea-style settlement is difficult to me to see in the short term. The other problem, of course, is that how do you trust Russia? You've already had these negotiations. If you kind of freeze the conflict at the lines of battle, Russia will, presumably spend the time preparing, regathering, rearming, and preparing for another assault. So I think that there's a real difficult issue there. And I think another question is about this, and I want to tie this in about Ukraine's membership of NATO. I think this probably is a strong long-term solution to guarantee the security of Ukraine. I think EU membership should come first, and I think it will come first. The problem is that you do need a kind of slowdown in the fighting before Ukraine can be let into NATO, because I don't think that the member countries are going to sign on to a country joining that's currently in the middle of a war with an armed conflict, which kind of de facto means everyone's then at war with Russia. It seems slightly unlikely to me. But if there is any kind of pause in a Korea-style settlement, admitting NATO, or at least kind of giving Ukraine ironclad security guarantees, could potentially be a deterrent against future escalation. But again, we've only seen escalation work in one way so far in this conflict. So I don't know.
So maybe that's actually the carrot Ukraine's side, that sort of, okay, you've done everything you could. We've given you everything we can or we want. It's time for you to sort of give up. Let's call an armistice line here. And I mean, part of why we've had a 70-year armistice in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, is because that armistice has been backed up by, full faith and credit of the US military for
Mhm.
70 years. And certainly Ukrainian admission into NATO as a precondition of this long-term armistice would probably be a pretty good incentive, you think?
Yeah, in a way, it would be an incentive in terms of kind of guaranteeing the kind of continued future existence of Ukraine, and hopefully the prevention of a future conflict. But any deal is going to be a bad deal for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's depressing, and the fact that all these people, innocent people, have lost their lives for nothing, really. Including recently a very prominent Ukrainian writer who died in a missile strike in Kramatorsk last week. Selling that to the public, basically saying, here's your carrot after tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in this war. I don't think it looks like a great deal. But the thing is, there really are no other options. I would love for Ukrainian tanks to go down central Moscow on Tverskaya Boulevard, but it seems very unlikely that this is ever going to happen. So without any kind of decisive move on the battlefield, which seems increasingly unlikely given how much the sides have kind of entrenched and how much the looming kind of ammunition shortage for both sides is going to play a factor, it seems kind of major breakthroughs are unlikely. So a NATO deal might provide some future security, but again, I think it would have to be in a time of relative peacetime, certainly not active conflict.
So one of the last questions here is there anything else the US or the EU could do to put pressure on Russia to de-escalate? But I want to add something to this. Do you think there's any role for China? And then we have to sort of look inside of Xi Jinping's head and see where he is with this. I think there's a potential role for presuming that what the United States and the EU can do in terms of sanctions is exhausted. Is there what that China could or would do to pressure Russia to de-escalate and come to the table?
I think there is a role for, and China has been playing an active role. I think it was just yesterday or even this morning that the FT reported that, well, they reported that Chinese officials have been saying they talked Putin down off the nuclear ledge, and that they've been putting pressure on him to stop the rhetoric of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which has borne out. I mean, that's kind of interesting thing where you don't know, did that actually happen? Possibly. Is this just the idea that the Chinese want to communicate that they're the kind of moderating role in this? Also possible. Um, there's certainly a role for China. I mean, China's played a major role throughout all of this. Could they kind of exercise more significant economic power to bring Russia to the table? Sure. But at the same time, I don't think that China and the EU and the United States share the same goals or the same desires for how this conflict will end. And at the same time, it's not just China that's keeping Russia economically alive. One of the largest purchasers of Russian oil is India. And a lot of the global South is firmly not in the camp of the United States and NATO and the Western countries in denouncing Russia's aggression. So, in a situation where China isolates Russia more, does that apply economic pressure? Sure, but would not completely isolate the country at all. Um, in terms of what measures the United States and the EU can do to put pressure on Russia to come to the table, I guess people would just say providing more advanced arms and weaponries to support Ukraine's advance on the battlefield is probably one of the best methods. I mean, there's not a ton left in the economic sphere in terms of, unless you have a full embargo of Russian commodities. But again, we know that half the world won't sign off on that, and it's kind of more or less de facto already happening with the West and NATO. And also, a lot of this Russian oil is going to India, being refined in India, and then sold back to the West as non-Russian oil, as Indian processed oil. So there's a lot of kind of economic concerns and a lot of really limited options available for all sides, which points to the idea that the conflict is going to kind of continue until both sides are exhausted.
Yeah. And I think the third world as well. I mean, I'm thinking about BRICS. I'm also thinking the Indonesian defense minister made some very provocative and very interesting, and I think quite frank and candid comments at the last Shangri-La meeting, where he basically said, look, I understand this is a Western country and you guys are all kind of focused on this, but in our part of the world, we've just kind of had to accept that we're going to be invaded and we're going to lose territory and people are hungry. So can we get this over with? And I
Hmm.
wonder if that's going to start to build as well. And
Hmm.
who's going to pick up the mantle? Is it going to be India? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be Indonesia? It'd be really, I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out. So,
And it might be no one. And there's also, again, I think even today I read really interesting reporting coming out of China that they basically they're some people within their kind of foreign ministry kind of government apparatus kind of understands Europe's position on the Russia-Ukraine war as the return of ideology. They don't understand why Germany is kind of doing all this economic damage to itself, and the only explanation they can come up with is this the return of ideologues, which kind of disappeared in 1991 at the end of history, and now it's coming back. So that's their interpretation of it, which I think is very different than what we would think of it. But at the same time, yeah, you're right. I think that we have to kind of remember that the United States and Europe's position on this conflict is not shared globally.
well, we could probably chat on about this and get more questions for hours. Dakota, this has just been so fascinating. And as always, I really appreciate the level of context that you are able to provide, immediate sort of on the ground level of detail that I think is hard for most of us to get from sort of the, mainstream media, even The Economist, but also the historical context. I think it really gives us a better understanding of the dynamic within Russia and, with Ukraine as well. So thank you again for giving of your time to the World Affairs Council of Maine audience. And also thank you, as always, to our sponsors and to everyone out there in our audience. We really appreciate all these great questions and your continued engagement in the World Affairs Council of Maine. So I hope you'll all go out and watch some fireworks tonight before it rains again. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. Dakota, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure. Take care, everyone.
All right. Good night now.